I grew up with a dad that was very much pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and keep going. I grew up playing sports and skateboarding and doing all kinds of stuff outside, and so you get hurt a lot. And every time you get hurt, you just kind of stand up, you walk it off, you brush it off, no blood, no foul, you just keep going. And there was this one time when we got Razor scooters, my brother and I did for Christmas, and it was like the coolest thing you could get that year. That was the thing that everybody wanted. And we were jumping our scooters like over skateboards and off of curbs and stuff, and just like screwing around, having fun. And I took this crazy weird fall. And I landed like super weird, like twisting my leg kind of funky, and my foot stuck into the asphalt in the middle of the street, and nothing like super crazy to see. But I heard this pop, and then my ankle was just so sore, and I just couldn't move. And so my brother went inside the house and got my dad came out, and he was just like same way, like, come on, stand up, let's go, pick yourself up, keep moving, like get inside, we'll get you some ice or whatever, but just like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and go. But I couldn't stand, like my ankle was killing me. And I knew there was something wrong. I didn't know how bad it was, but I knew there was something wrong, and it turns out that I broke it. But I couldn't stand up. And so eventually my dad realized like I wasn't playing around, I wasn't being a baby, like I was in pain. And so he came and he helped pick me up, and I put my arm around him, and we kind of hopped back into the house. Because eventually my dad recognized that I was suffering, and he saw that suffering, and he wanted to help. So closing out chapter 2, we see the people of Israel in Egypt. We've looked at Moses' life. We've seen his birth, his rescue, his triumph in Egypt in some way as like this ascent to almost a prince, and then his downfall, and then run away into the desert, into Midian, and finally begin to see redemption through God. And God blesses him with a family, and God begins to work in his life and in his heart. And so chapter 2 closes with this. It's just a couple of verses, so I'm going to read it. During those many days, the king of Egypt died, and the people of Israel groaned because of their slavery and cried out for help. Their cry for rescue from slavery came up to God, and God heard their groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. God saw the people of Israel, and God knew. Have you ever felt like you're suffering and you cry out to God, you cry out to your parents, you cry out to somebody, and you just want them to understand? You just want them to know that you're in pain. What we see at the end of chapter 2, it's that God knew. See, our lives may have suffering. Our lives may have pain. Sometimes that's relational. Sometimes that's some other kind of suffering like poverty or a desire that we aren't seeing fulfilled in our lives. Or sometimes people hurt us, harm us, take things from us. We might have suffering in our life, but the important thing to remember is that God sees it. God had made a promise to the people of Israel. He had started with Abraham, and then Abraham's son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob. Remember, Jacob becomes Israel, so his kids become the tribes of Israel. At the beginning of Exodus, we see this generation after generation growing and growing. That all comes from these 3 generations of men. And what we see in this just 3 verses is that God sees their suffering. He knows their promise, the promise that he made to them. He remembers it. It's not that God ever forgot, like, oh yeah, by the way. It's that God did remember it. And in spite of the suffering, he was still working that promise out. God had a plan, even in the midst of that suffering. And so when we see that the people of Israel are in this servitude, this slavery to the nation of Egypt, and they're beginning to cry out as a king has now died, they're just waiting for the next generation of leader to continue to push them down. They're crying out to God for help. And God sees them. God sees us in our suffering. God doesn't look at a world full of sin and pain and evil and say, meh, oh well. God is a heavenly Father who sees children in need. And he has sent his son Jesus to come and bring salvation, bring hope, bring healing to that suffering, to restore his creation as something good that he desires as it was created to be. And his restoration comes through Jesus. And so Jesus was willing to suffer to end the suffering for the rest of us. Jesus took upon himself the suffering of this world so that we could have hope that suffering would end forever. Revelation 21 describes heaven as a place where God dwells, where we are his people and he is our God, and there's no mourning, no crying, no death, that there is peace. So when we're in the midst of suffering, of trial, of even just having to be patient for something that we desire and believe that God desires for us, and we have to wait for that, we can continue to trust that God sees us, that he knows our suffering, and that he is working to bring restoration, to bring healing, that his plan is still something that he is committed to, that he loves us.